Good morning, everyone. That sounded a lot better. Welcome to the second day of the ASME conference. If you haven't met me, my name is Ria George. I have two roles at ASME. I'm ASME's secretary and ASME's lead for diversity. And if you joined us yesterday, we hope you had a fantastic day at the conference. And if you've just joined us today, a very warm welcome. So today is packed in terms of the programme with exciting workshops, presentations, e-posters and many more sessions. And to start us off today, I am delighted to introduce our first plenary speaker, who is Sabena Jameel Chowdhury. Sabena is an Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Professionalism at Birmingham Medical School and a general practitioner. Sabena's primary interest and expertise is around fueling meaningful conversations on character and how this defines our understanding of professionalism. So please join me in welcoming Sabena.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us at 8:30, which is a tad early, but thank you. I thought we should start with a bit of plagiarism. So I'm going to reuse Hugh Alberti's stepping on toes disclaimer because it applies to me as well. These are not my employer's thoughts, they're my own thoughts. I'm going to skim over some really important concepts, so apologies to Aristotle, to bioethicists and to educationalists. Some things I say are going to be a bit controversial and provocative, so I urge you to be patient with me and put up with some of these innovative and crazy ideas, and your open-mindedness is appreciated. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to define what the malady of medicine is, so obviously malady being an illness or a poison, and the resultant demoralization. We'll then move on to describe an antidote, and I will propose that practical wisdom is an antidote. I use the model of Phronesis as described by Aristotle, and I will explain that in more detail later. I'll outline my PhD, which was mixed methods empirical work on enacted phronesis in doctors, and obviously I'll define phronesis, but just in essence, it's about doing the right thing at the right time for the right person for the right reason. So it has a moral orientation, and it's very contextual as opposed to generalizable rules that we often use. I'll then present the fish school theory of practical wisdom, which came to me while I was doing my PhD, and I'll postulate the next steps for medical educators. But what I wanted to do at the outset, actually, is speak a little bit about assumptions, positioning, and interests. And I thought I would start with a picture of me as a wee tot. I had to get that. So there is a picture of me many years ago with my dad. My existence here now in the UK was actually driven by some deeply held values my dad had about the fact that healthcare should be free. So in the late 1960s, he came over with that value, deeply held because no other country in the world was doing that, and obviously the NHS was here. And I think the fact that I'm standing here about 55 years on would have made him quite proud of what's happened subsequently. And when he arrived at Euston Station, he had £50 and a thick coat because he arrived in December, and nothing else, actually. So yeah, I've got to thank my dad. He's no longer with us. So I'm from Indian immigrants, firstborn, basically. My ancestors were doctors, and actually I'm really fascinated by how Eastern medicine and Western medicine conceive wisdom, actually. I adopt very broad definitions of professionalism, and I need to explain it now because I know that some of you might not have the same interpretation of professionalism as I have. Most of you map it to some legal maxims, some GMC mandates, but I use my broad definition are things like it is a trust-generating promise. It is the morality of medicine. And if you think about trust generation and morality, what we're really talking about is values, opinions, and feelings. And if we put care and compassion at the center of professionalism, the principles emanate from that. So the principles of confidentiality, of respect, if you genuinely care for that other human being. And I think that is the core of professionalism. I self-funded my PhD, but later got educational bursaries from Health Education England, who I worked for at the time, and the University of Birmingham, and that ended up offsetting about 50% of my costs. And I was affiliate student of the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, which is actually the School of Education at the University of Birmingham. They are funded by the Templeton Foundation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to suggest that practical wisdom, rather than knowledge, is a more appropriate framework that holistically embraces professional identity formation and the ethical orientation to medical practice. And I think this encapsulates what I'm trying to say, really. A physician of practical wisdom is the kind of colleague whom other clinicians trust, the kind of supervisor one can count on to be honest, conscientious and fair, the kind of doctor one would trust with a parent, a spouse or a child at the most painful and vulnerable times of his or her life. The physician of practical wisdom is the physician who best embodies professionalism, as that concept is described by the modern professionalism movement. So what do I mean by the malady of medicine? I'm going to courageously assert that the ethical frameworks that underpin healthcare are deficient. And I'm also going to assert that the educational frameworks that underpin medical education are biased. And this then leads to widespread demoralization. And I want you to contemplate in the frameworks that we're using, where is the room for morality? And if there is no room for morality, maybe that's what explains why we feel demoralized. So the first statement is the ethical frameworks that shape healthcare are deficient. And actually, they lead to inflexibility. There is a predominance on rules-based ethics, and by that I'm referring to Bentham and Mill's utilitarianism, which is essentially what underpins the formation of the foundation of the NHS, doing the greatest good for the most people. And the other one is deontology. Most famously, Immanuel Kant promoted that, and it's about responsibility and duty. And the GMC duties of a doctor is very much underpinned by deontology, and it's filled with statements like you must and you should. Now, these are absolutely important and necessary, and they're good for achieving widespread adoption of minimum standards and attending to patient safety. And they're based on notions of the greatest benefit to all and on professional duty. But as I mentioned before, they can be inflexible. So my second statement is that the educational frameworks that shape medical education are biased, and positivism has a stronghold in medicine, and positivism stipulates that knowledge is unambiguous and it's predictable. Context is often stripped, and it's objective and value-free, and therefore, when you come up with laws and trends and patterns, these are reductionist, and values, opinions, and feelings are of no interest to positivism. And actually, these frameworks go back as far as technical rationality in the Enlightenment period, and they were perpetuated by Abraham Flexner's report in 1910, which reformed medical education. And there are other educational theories there, but I'm going to swing over to constructivism. And in constructivism, knowledge is socially constructed. It accepts multiple conflicting realities. It's about understanding and reconstruction. And if I express to you that wisdom is adjudicating when values conflict, then you can see how positivism doesn't serve as well when we're talking about values, opinions, feelings, and adjudicating values. And it's interpretive, and of course, values, opinions, and feelings play a central role. And my suggestion to you is that we should be au fait, we should be comfortable with using them all without a bias or a prejudice in one particular type of educational framework. And I was just thinking last night, actually, I really dislike the term soft skills because it devalues some of the most important things in medicine. And I wondered if it was, in fact, positivistic language that was gaslighting other ways of doing things. So which frameworks do you now think best suited to dealing with values, opinions, feelings, and wise judgments? Hilton and Slotnick wrote a really good paper called Proto-Professionalism, and in that they said that what we're actually focusing on because of this positivistic stronghold is science, expertise, technical rationality, mindlessness, bioscience, objectivity, detachment, evidence-based hierarchy, specialism, and interprofessionalism. But what we're not focusing on is art, professionalism, being a reflective practitioner, mindfulness, humanism, subjectivity, empathy, being relationship-centered, collegiality, generalism, and interprofessionalism. And something else that I came across this weekend that I thought was absolutely fascinating was a quote by Doris Lessing. She won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and it was a quote from a book called The Golden Notebook, and I'm going to read it to you now. "You're in the process of being indoctrinated. What you're being taught here is an amalgam of current prejudice and the choices of this particular culture. You're being taught by people who've been able to accommodate themselves to a regime of thought laid down by their predecessors. It is a self-perpetuating system. Those of you who are more robust and individual will be encouraged to leave and find ways of educating yourself, educating your own judgments. Those that stay must remember always that they are being moulded and patterned to the narrow and particular needs of a particular society." I just want to move on to a quote by Karen Montgomery that kind of summarizes what I've just said. "Medicine, just as it's always been, is practice, informed action taken on behalf of sick people. Not only narrative and interpretive, but scientific too. But this does not make it a science in and of itself." So here I came up with a sort of heuristic diagram to contrast rules and values. So at the bottom, the exclamation mark reflects poor practice, and the star at the top reflects excellence. And I think the rules and the values get you to about halfway, where the dark blue stops. And obviously these are minimum standards, they are patient safety, they're assessment criteria, and it means that most people are there. And in fact, some people even evade the rules and cheat and things around that area. But what you don't get, you can't mandate for compassion. So I've put a little heart in the top half of that diagram. Compassion comes from somewhere else. It comes from nurturing your own virtues, your own professional virtues. And what I thought was really interesting is that our language already summarizes this, actually. You might get feedback from patients that say, you went above and beyond. And I believe what they're actually referring to is the top half of that diagram. And a famous Scottish philosopher, David Hume, had said that the law limits every power that it gives. And I'm wondering if that is also at that halfway mark. The law is limiting that capacity for excellence, and therefore it is reductionist. I don't know if Professor Hafferty is here, but here is his quote. "Most values are learnt through role modelling and the hidden curriculum." And we need to be really mindful of that when we're thinking of cramming curriculums, that some of the most important things you learn will not be from cramming it in a curriculum. It will be from things like organisational culture. It's about what you see when you're on placements, and it's about how you act as role models, as educators. So I'm now going to move on to practice knowledge. And practice knowledge in itself requires you navigating value conflicts. So there'll be times where you're thinking, how honest should I be with this patient, when I contrast that with being kind, when I contrast that with trying to protect them, etc. So honesty, kindness, protection, they can conflict with each other. And there's other examples. I like this diagram from Della Fish and Linda de Cossart. And they say that practice requires at least 14 different types of knowledge. And they outline them in the diagram. But the one that medical education focuses on the most is obviously evidence-based knowledge. But I just wanted to point out that down at the bottom is intuitive knowledge and insight and imaginative knowledge. How much time do we spend talking about that? So what do you need? What are the requirements of phronesis? Well, obviously you need to comprehend and recognize what's happening, what are the morally important features. You need good sense, common sense and intuition. You need intelligence and a grasp of the situation and what needs to be done. And you need cleverness in executing a plan. So I'm now going to suggest a possible antidote. Practical wisdom is one of 5 intellectual virtues described by Aristotle, the others being episteme, which is scientific knowledge, techne, which is technical knowledge, sophia, which is philosophical knowledge, and nous, which is intellectual insight. It's rooted in virtue ethics, which is not one of the predominant ethical frameworks that we use in medicine, and I'm arguing it should be an adjunct. Phronesis is particularly suited to the work of a doctor, and it adjudicates when values conflict. It's about doing the right thing at the right time for the right person for the right reason, and it is context-specific. It has a moral orientation towards good, and it also links to purpose, which Aristotle said was telos, and flourishing, which he called eudaimonia. And just to give you some simple notions of virtue, Aristotle thought that it was the golden mean. It was the midpoint between two vices. So, for example, courage is the golden mean, that is the virtue, and the vices, an excess would be foolhardiness, and a deficiency would be cowardice. And I sometimes think and I imagine that when I'm doing my GP work, that I'm a bit like a graphic equalizer who has this sort of grid like that, and you kind of have to tweak things depending on the patient in front of you and depending on what's presenting to you. And another simplified definition of virtue is actually by the celebrity psychologist Jordan Peterson. I quite like this one. Virtue is knowing your monster power but not using it. So if you now take that into account, and I relate to you this beautiful quote that I found at the beginning of my PhD, Medical Wisdom in the 21st Century. I knew a doctor who was honest but gentle with his honesty, was loving but careful with his love, who was disciplined without being rigid and right without a stain of arrogance, who was self-questioning without self-doubt, introspective and reflective, and in the same moment decisive, who was strong, hard, and adamant, but all those things laced with tenderness and understanding. A doctor who worshipped his calling without worshipping himself, who was busy beyond belief, who had time to smile, to chat, to touch the shoulder, take the hand, who had time enough for death as well as life. So when I did my PhD, I did a critical interpretive literature review. I looked at the words phronesis and medic, so then obviously medical education, all of that stuff came up. I'm not obviously going to go through the 12 themes that I came up with, but what I did want to highlight to you, phronesis, is it the right term for the purposes of developing good doctors? The answer was yes, from the literature review. There was a clear lack of empirical work, which is why I went on to do some empirical work. Another theme was individual phronesis within organizations, and it became clear that we shouldn't just focus on individual phronesis, but we need to look at organizations supporting this process. And obviously, for this particular audience, there was questions of how to develop phronesis and phronesis education. So what does a wise doctor look like? My PhD looked at enacted phronesis in GPs in the West Midlands. I administered a wisdom questionnaire, the Antidote 3D wisdom questionnaire, to 211 GPs at 5 training events, and it included GPs in training as well. And the Antidote 3D wisdom questionnaire looked at the cognitive aspects of practice, so cognitive meaning the process of thinking and reasoning, the affective, so that's to do with their character, relating to feelings and attitudes, and the reflective aspects of practice. The outliers were then invited to undergo a biographic narrative interview, and I actually triangulated some of the responses with MSFs and PSQ data that they were collecting anyway for their NHS appraisals. I don't know if anybody's into top trumps, but my son certainly is, which is why I came up with this little poster. So the study was called the Enacted Phronesis in General Practitioners Study, and all of from the 211, there were 16 wisdom exemplars, and they met Antidote's criteria, high criteria for wisdom, and they got over 80% in their cognitive ability scores, over 80% for their reflective ability, and over 80% for their affective ability. I was debating whether I should interview low scorers as well, and I was advised that I should, because how do you know what typifies a wise doctor if you don't know what typifies an unwise doctor? But there was obviously clearly ethical issues with doing that. And as it happens, when I administered the questionnaire, those doctors could put their, if they were willing to go on to the next stage, had to put their details, contact details. But interestingly, most of the low scorers didn't. And this aligns with wisdom research about being open to new experience. So this is why I couldn't capture some of the low scorers. But I did, in fact, interview 2 low scorers. I asked a single question, and I didn't interrupt. I asked them, I'm interested in the experiences, the things and events and influences that have made you the doctor you are now. The shortest interview was 30 minutes. I have to say they were trainees, so they were under 30, so maybe their lives were shorter than those near retirement, and the longest interview was 2 hours long. And The importance of not interrupting them, I didn't understand until later when I tell you my findings. But basically, it was their gestalt, their flow, their little memory links, how one thing links to another. And that became really important when it came to analysing the data. So I analysed the transcripts in two ways. The first way was using a panel of 3, and I felt using a panel was more robust because it reduces one researcher's bias. And then we came up with vignettes, character statements, having broken down the transcript to look at their lived life and their told story, and this is a method described by Wengraf. I realised when I had these character statements that it was really difficult to compare and contrast. So then I looked at all the transcripts and did corpus linguistic frequency analysis, so then able to come up with a conceptual framework, and that enabled me to compare the different biographies, but also it allowed me to see what they were thinking, what they were feeling, how they knew what they were learning, how they dealt with uncertainty, something about their sense of self and practical action. So I'm going to read you some of those vignettes. We have Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean is one of the youngest people I interviewed. He lives with a conscious sense of gratitude towards people who have been influential in his life and sacrificed for him, including his parents and teachers. He deploys great humility in understanding his own limitations, valuing the input of others and learning from near misses in the past. He understands that pure intellect is different from common sense and places value on the latter. He is motivated by the avoidance of guilt, having a strong sense of responsibility to his patients and those who've helped him, especially parents. He's been profoundly impacted by spending time in palliative care, which reinforced to him the human connection and good communication are more important than cold professionalism. An experience of powerlessness when attending a hospital as a relative has further motivated Mr. Bean to keep an open mind, to see the big picture and to meet people at a human level rather than missing them in medical activity. You then have Egeria. Egeria's life is grounded in giving and receiving love. Her initial response to challenge of medicine was one of uncertainty in her own ability, but she sought experiences which would prove her resilience. She is keenly aware of injustice and the value people should be shown, regardless of their economic and social status. She's been formed in the crucible of a life-threatening injury, which has taught her the value of life, leaving with her a sense of priority and the need to make encounters meaningful. She reflects on her own loving upbringing in the way she embraces her patients. She's reflected about the nuanced ways her persona affects patient interactions. She welcomes the possibility of change and improved care, creating an environment where people can be honest about their experiences. Then we have Yoda. Yoda is a healer. He's been fascinated by healing since he was a small child, seeing spiritual work with his grandmother. He has devoted his life to healing, being the source of clarity for others to receive what is in them. He's been inspired by mystical healing and healing avenues which sit alongside but separate to traditional Western medicine. He's become comfortable and competent wherever healing is to be found and in whatever way it is to be achieved. His role models are those whose lives are long and devoted to healing and helping others. His marriage to his wife and to medicine enable him to stay connected to the source and witness all things working together for good. He rejects concepts of failure, judgment, and productivity, preferring to center his life on serving others in ways that produce freedom and health. He's passionate about inspiring trainees and is compassionate towards them as they navigate the system he is uncomfortable with. He will remain a healer until the end, seeking new ways and expression to see patients released to health. And I have 16 of these, but I'm only going to read you one more. Mary. From an early age, Mary has demonstrated self-belief and self-knowledge that has led her to find paths that align with her being. Her life has been overarched by what some may perceive as physical disability, but she has proven with optimism, determination, loyalty, and love that she can and has exceeded expectations of others and herself. She has two main themes that drive her actions. One is ability to do big picture thinking, aiming for overall good, accepting bad phases as a step towards overall joy. She's accepted inequality and compromise in order to achieve this holistic goal. The second is the golden rule, do unto others as you would want for yourself. Mary is deeply empathic. Her moral compass is strong and secular in nature. She's open-minded and embraces broad experience. Mary believes that people themselves hold the answers to the questions they seek answers for. So just in summary, some other findings. The main differences between the low and high-scoring doctors seem to be their ability to deal with uncertainty and their approach to challenge, but at what expense to themselves. All the doctors could do or act the job. The wisest doctors were the happiest doctors. I wanted to test Aristotle's postulation that phronesis leads to eudaimonia, to flourishing. And so I added a question in the Ardelt 3D Wisdom Questionnaire, and it did appear that those wise doctors were generally much happier than the rest of the cohort. These wise doctors were not competing with others. They were striving to be the best versions of themselves. They had a very strong sense of personal agency, a locus of control. And irrespective of religious belief, they followed the golden rule: do unto others as you would want for yourself. Many had high levels of compassion stemming from their own family experiences. Many had undergone difficult times, but had reflected in a constructive way that led to personal growth. And I do feel very much it aligns with Carol Dweck's work on mindset, where she speaks about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. They relished challenge and the learning that came from that, and they were not scared to fail. Failure is a path to success. They had no regrets about their life. It made them who they are today. And they were humble and self-effacing. It says chicken ownership there. That's a story for another day. That's a clickbait correlation that I happened to find. So what I love about the wisdom exemplars is that disability, illness, youth, vulnerability, failure, multi-ethnicities, all featured in the wisdom exemplars' lives. Contrast that to when you use knowledge as a central focus and we have a problem with differential attainment. Most of these exemplars consider themselves average ability at medical school, which begs the question, are we measuring the right thing at medical school? And it has been an absolute honour to interview them. So having looked at the corpus of the data, I came up with 34 constituents of wisdom. And interestingly, I put these little constituents on Post-it notes, and these Post-it notes had a little triangle on the end, just like there. In fact, that is an absolute representation of what I did. But I realized that they didn't fit on a piece of paper in a straight line. So I had to put them with a curve. And then when I did that, I thought, oh, they look like fish. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. I'll go through those in a minute. But basically, I put them into rough categories of quality, context, mental habits, knowledge of self, relational, and practical action. But what was interesting about this diagram was that they were moving towards action. And that is precisely what Aristotle stipulated. So I don't like the categories because I feel they are fluid and they can dip in and out of the categories, but here they are. Some of the qualities of the exemplars were they were intellectually humble, they were value-driven, they were open, they were intuitive, they were in touch with their feelings, and they were reflective learners. The context was that they enjoyed challenge, they had broad life experiences, and difficult times. Mental habits, they were able to reframe. I initially put optimism, but I've decided it's probably a lack of pessimism, but that's debatable. Failure is falling forward. Appreciative of different perspectives, they were critical thinkers, and they accept uncertainty as normal. And then we look at their knowledge of self. They're growth-orientated, they're forward-thinking, they're innovative. They know that guidelines are just a guide. They make judgments in context. They are self-competitive. They want to be the best versions of themselves. Their motivators are internal, and they have a strong sense of agency. And relationally, they have healthy boundaries. I don't think we talk about boundaries enough with regard to having a healthy career in medicine. They're good communicators. They're committed to justice. They're resilient. They value human connection. They follow the golden rule. Relationships, they feel loved somehow. They're other-centered, and this leads to activism and compassionate action. So yesterday, Eileen Barrett said, never say that no one to date has done this. So I'm about to do that. No one to date has really understood phronesis in relation to purpose and flourishing. And Aristotle did mention this, but he never described it. And most existing models of wisdom from the philosophers and the psychologists describe the components as static parts, whereas I think now I'm hoping that you will see it's a process. So I'm pretty sure that no one has really put fish and the process of practical wisdom together, which is how I came up with the fish school theory of practical wisdom. So if you imagine the little phi of fish, I'm just going to read some statements that will hopefully make some sense to you. So the fish school theory outlines practical wisdom as a process. It connects practical wisdom to the concepts of action, purpose, meaning, and flourishing. Practical wisdom is a process, not a collection of static constituents. The process moves towards action. The action is meaningful and has purpose. The whole school is greater than the parts. And this fits in with Gestalt psychology. So if you know anything about Gestalt psychology, it's based on the whole is greater than the parts. And this was maintained in my research methodology. Each constituent works in synergy with the others, but it is also independent. The fish school offers community, nourishment, and protection from predators. The fish flourish in the school, they can reproduce. Aristotle stated Phronesis is a route to eudaimonia, but he didn't explain how. Fish schools don't do well in artificial environments, thus environment is important. And I believe that nature can teach us much about complex systems, including practical wisdom. I have outlined a few biographies, including a little bit of my own and of the wisdom exemplars, but what I want you to think about is possibly Aristotle's biography. And this came later, and I thought it was mind-blowing, to be honest. Aristotle was considered the first ichthyologist. Before he wrote ethics, politics, and metaphysics, he studied animals, and he wrote parts of animals. And in fact, he spent 3 years studying fish in the Aegean Sea. He was on Lesbos, he got married, he had a child, and I'm wondering if maybe fish are the original inspiration. And so I think it could help us really embrace holistic medical education ecosystems. So what are the next steps for medical educators? I think we need to raise awareness about the frameworks that underpin medical education and maybe talk about their shortcomings. Contemplate knowledge in the context of wisdom and how we can educate for wiser doctors with a moral orientation. Maybe establish a practical wisdom in medicine network. I think we need to do more research into different specialisms, and it'd be really interesting to look at different breeds of fish school, the surgeons, the palliative cares, doctors, the psychiatrists. And I think it would be really useful to have some metadata insights on all medical practitioners. I think we can use practical wisdom models for CPD and formative improvement. I think we can integrate it to curriculums, but also understanding how it can impact organizational culture and hidden curriculums. I think we need to contemplate if wisdom should be assessed, and if so, how. And can we imagine if flourishing was the goal? Igor Grossman is a psychologist from Canada. He's done loads of work on wisdom, and he has stated that wisdom leads leads to well-being, and well-being paves the way for wisdom, in particular wise action, not just the capacity for wise reasoning. Thank you, Asmi, and thank you, Abdi.
Thank you, Sabena, for such a wonderful talk. We're opening the floor up to questions. You can ask questions live if you'd like. Please do put up your hand, and we've got volunteers on either side that have roving mics. You can also ask questions via our app, Venox, and we've got a few that have come in, so I'll get going. We've got one from Nero Amin. Do you think similar results would have been achieved with secondary care doctors?
I've contemplated this, and I don't know. I would like us to do the work. I myself can't do the work, in that it's a big job, but I think it would be really interesting. And there were some features in my GPs that I don't necessarily think you would find in some specialty doctors. I don't want it to be a competition between which speciality is the wisest, but it would be really interesting work to do.
We've got a question from Bob McKinley. Is it time to cast off the term soft skills and talk about sophisticated skills?
Absolutely. I'm so with you. And like I say, I do feel it's a hangover term. It's a almost derogatory term from the technical rationality enlightenment period. I think we need to get rid of it.
Another question from Jill Thistlethwaite. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Your research is rooted in general practice. What might be similarities and differences with our colleagues in other healthcare specialties?
Thank you, Jill. You marked my master's dissertation many years ago from Warwick. So raise your hand because I'd like to meet you. Thank you. I do think there's going to be differences, but I also think there's going to be value in getting metadata because there's going to be so many things in common. I don't know what else to say. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. I mean, the one thing I wanted to express with my last slide is there is so much experience and expertise in the room. I'm pretty novice. I've only just done my PhD, but I have been in medical education leadership for a while. But I'm hoping that you will have some ideas of how to take this forward if you've bought into some of the ideas.
We've got a live question at this table here.
Hi. So I'm quite interested in professional identity formation, especially when it comes to medical students in their early clinical years. When I think about wisdom, in my eyes, that's something that can take time and experience to develop. Do you think that we can bring wisdom into the curriculum for early years of medical students, or do you think it's something that you can only sort of develop with practice?
No, I absolutely think you can. And I was absolutely delighted that there was GP trainees that scored incredibly high wisdom scores. Just think about it, they're under 30, and the likelihood is they're probably wiser than their supervisors. I do talk about wisdom with medical students, even quite early on. And what I wanted maybe to highlight most is this myth of perfection. And I wanted to show that there are exemplars out there who have got disability, who are BAME, and they're thriving and they're flourishing. And maybe this treadmill that you're on, this knowledge and assessment treadmill, is not the one that is best for nurturing your professional identity, your happiness, who you want to be and what you want to get out of life, and meaning in medicine.
Thank you. We've got another question further at the back there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a great talk and I really enjoyed it. I wonder what you think about the FRCGP exam and whether that's making wise GPs.
Do you want a single word answer that starts with N? I feel frustrated that assessment drives learning. I feel frustrated that it hijacks the agenda and that people can't be themselves. I think it's important that we do have standards, but I see it in medical school. They become like animals when it comes to deciles, and it stresses people out so much. And I'm thinking it's vanity. It's not helping matters. And I think we need to develop people holistically, not just their knowledge content, but their character and their ability to really introspect and be self-reflective. There's a really interesting comparison of see what you want to put on your CV and your eulogy virtues. So what they might say at your funeral. I think it's important we develop those, but we ignore them. People don't talk about failure. People don't talk about how we navigate that and get through. All these big shot leaders have all failed something, but all we ever see is how amazing they are and how perfect they are.
Thank you, Sabena. I can see there's more questions flourishing in and those that have live questions. We've sadly come to the end of our time, but Sabena will be around at the conference today and tomorrow, so please do find her. And if you can join me in thanking her again for her presentation.